What if the biblical giants were wiped rather than disappearing? Silent but unavoidable, its whisper slashes through time like a blade. It's more than just a query. It's difficult, and this whisper will not be quieted in a society where polished lies have paved over ancient realities. It infiltrates the thoughts of people who have always sensed that something is lacking. Something hidden beneath centuries of silence, translations, and modifications. A monk in the Ethiopian highlands unfolds a scroll that most people have never seen before, deep within a centuries-old monastery that has been tarnished by time and candle smoke. There is no astonishment in his gaze. They are stable. It seems as though he is recalling something that the world has forgotten rather than making a new discovery. A young man is sitting in a city flat far from the monastery looking through digital snippets of literature that are prohibited. He no longer believes what he initially perceives. The documentaries, the textbooks, even the sermons. Like someone drew a line and said, "Don't look past this." They all seem to halt abruptly. The Ethiopian Bible, however, does. It crosses that boundary and continues to move. It describes creatures that are too tall, too strong, and too closely related to the fall of man to be written off as myth. These were not allegories. They were named. They possessed kingdoms. And they had a purpose based on these pages. Just enough is revealed in the Western Bible to pique interest. Yes, the Nephilim is mentioned. It refers to them as men of renown and mighty men of old. The narrative then wanes. The specifics disappear, as though someone was afraid of what would occur if we found out. The Bible in Ethiopia is unflinching. It gives them names, explains them, traces their ancestry back several generations. Most ominously, it implies that they could not be completely gone. It has never been easy to tell the truth. Furthermore, the winners did not write history, real history. They modified it. Every culture has its buried bones. In Africa, however, the burial was intentional. More than just names were removed by colonial hands. Evidence was removed. Evidence that long before pyramids and prophets there were giants, who walked with men, ruled with terror, and fell in disgrace. Still, there are echoes of them, in hidden scrolls, in oral stories told by grandmothers too afraid to write them down, in paintings older than empires. They remain not as legends, but as a haunting absence in the version of history we were taught to accept. Some say the giants were symbols, representations of sin, pride, or ancient fear. But if that's true, why were so many ancient cultures across continents describing the same beings with the same terrifying detail? From the Book of Enoch to the Kebra Nagast, the pattern repeats. Giants born from fallen beings, giants that ruled until they provoked divine judgment, and then silence. The kind of silence that only comes when someone is trying to erase what was once screamed aloud. That's why this isn't just about old texts or forgotten scrolls. It's about now, about why we're only told fragments, about why the Ethiopian Bible was kept out of the Western canon, and why, when people finally read it, they don't just see new stories, they start asking old questions. Questions about identity, about origins, about what else has been kept in the dark. This isn't a documentary for the curious. It's for the restless, for those who feel something has always been missing from the story they were given. Because maybe the real story was never lost. Maybe it was hidden on purpose. Subscribe to the Ethiopian Bible channel and hit the bell icon. This journey is just beginning. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the giants were real, and why do you think this part of history was hidden? One of the verses that lingers in your memory is Genesis 6:4, which teases something huge but leaves you in suspense. There were giants in those days, it states plainly. However, the Bible continues as though that one sentence provides sufficient justification. There were no explanations for their existence, no stories about what happened to these giants, and no information. It resembles an enigma that has been allowed to drift away, a whisper lost in the wind. However, those words, just a few short lines, hold the key to a tale far larger than most of us were ever taught. Imagine exploring ancient ruins, where massive columns still rise like skeletons against the sky, and crumbling stones that once formed powerful walls. A different era is depicted by these relics of a vanished past. Giants have left their mark in legends that have been passed down from Europe to Asia, from Africa to the Americas. Strange sculptures, peculiar footprints, and fossils all allude to creatures that are taller and more powerful than the average man. The Western Bible hardly mentions this fact, but they endure in myths and tales that are passed down through the ages. Genesis 6:4 contains the term Nephilim in the same passage. The meaning of this enigmatic phrase, which is frequently translated as giants, is more complex. Beings created by the combination of the sons of God with human women, the Nephilim were referred to as fallen ones. Scholars have been perplexed by this peculiar Genesis narrative for ages. Why does the Bible make a passing reference to them before continuing as though it were a footnote? Why don't Sunday school classes explore the identities of these Nephilim and their significance to the world? That portion of the story seems to have been written to be forgotten. There's a reason behind this silence. Due to centuries of translation and editing, the Western Bible frequently avoids contentious or challenging subjects. Simple narratives regarding the origins of humanity are threatened by the Nephilim tale. It alludes to ancient abilities and hybrid creatures that blur the boundaries between normal and monstrous, divine and human. Many people cannot accept or even consider these experiences because they are too complicated and upsetting. Rather, the Western tradition ignores the giants as though they were an oddity rather than an essential component of the biblical narrative, instead emphasizing the ark, the flood, and the rebirth of humanity. Where historical giants ought to stand tall, this omission creates a void, a shadow. In many ways, the Nephilim are reduced to ghosts in the book, acknowledged but not seen, their story a piece of a puzzle that isn't part of the whole. Questions arise in this silence. What was life like for these giants? How did they fare following the flood? Why did their tales get lost in the narrative of human history? There is a noticeable difference when comparing the Ethiopian Bible. These creatures, names, descriptions, and well-documented legacies can be found there. However, the Nephilim are a minor character in the Western canon, hardly recognized and seldom comprehended. Across myths, half-forgotten folklore, and ancient ruins, the traces of these giants may still be seen. However, the official narrative swiftly ignores these, leaving the majority of readers with just awe and curiosity. Why was a significant portion of biblical history left undefined? Why was quiet preferred over narrative in the Western canon? Looking past the gaps and shadows to a history that defies erasure, these are the questions this voyage will attempt to answer. Because sometimes the words are not as loud as the silence. Something extraordinary is contained in the Ethiopian Bible, an old book that has been obscured by time and conflict, lost to the majority of the world. This is the Book of Enoch, which offers a nearly forgotten aspect of biblical history that is full of stirring tales that challenge the very basis of many people's beliefs. The Ethiopian Bible has retained it intact for generations, like a secret, while the majority of Western Bibles do not. Within the pages of this book, the Watcher's story comes to life. These were angels, celestial creatures, who gazed down on the planet and made a decision that altered the course of history. They crossed a line they were never supposed to cross and came down to the human realm. Their actions were a cosmic insurrection, rather than a minor act of disobedience. They imparted prohibited knowledge to humanity, including the techniques of magic and warfare, as well as mysteries regarding the Earth's functioning and the stars. The Watchers disseminated this knowledge, which was never intended for humanity and permanently altered the course of human history. However, they did more than just teach. The children of these angels' marriages to human women were giants known as the Nephilim, who were neither entirely human nor entirely divine. They were deadly, strong, and remarkable. The harmony of the natural and spiritual realms was upset by the havoc they caused, which spread throughout the planet. This hybrid race was an actual manifestation of a more profound struggle that was taking place beyond of human perception. A single figure emerges from this chaos: Enoch. He is a guy who walks with God, not a warrior or a ruler. When Enoch notices what is going on, he becomes extremely disturbed. The weight of knowledge and humanity's fate weigh heavily on his heart. He makes an effort to alert humanity, begging them to see the serious peril they are in. There is a sense of urgency in Enoch's voice, a fervent hope that people would pay attention before it's too late. This is portrayed in the Book of Enoch as more than a story about giants or fallen angels. It exposes a spiritual conflict, a continuous struggle between justice and rebellion, between those who oppose and those who work to restore divine order. The Watcher's demise was not the result of a careless error. Rather, it was a revolt that questioned God's authority and threatened to destroy the world. There are no visible armies or swords being used in this conflict. It's a struggle between spiritual forces and wills in worlds beyond than the physical. The Earth's giants are the outward manifestation of this unseen conflict, and their effects have been felt for centuries. What many regard as myth or legend is actually a chronicle of this intense conflict, as the Book of Enoch demonstrates. By incorporating this text, the Ethiopian Bible encourages readers to view the biblical narrative from a new perspective. It reveals a past in which angels have occasionally been rebels whose deeds require retribution rather than always being messengers of light. It describes a world in which divine justice is a required restoration of equilibrium rather than merely punishment. This viewpoint makes it easier to comprehend why certain aspects of the biblical story were edited out of Western adaptations. We are forced to consider difficult spiritual issues as a result of the Watcher's tale, which calls into question easy definitions of good and evil. It challenges us to think about how history is affected by decisions and fights that took place in worlds other than our own and goes beyond what we can perceive. Enoch's caution is still relevant today, serving as a reminder that some realities are unsettling yet necessary. His message is unmistakable. The globe is still impacted by the Watcher's legacy, and humanity is at a turning point. This is more than just an old story. It's a reminder that our present is still shaped by the spiritual conflicts of the past, and a call to consciousness. The Ethiopian Bible provides insight into this obscure past by conserving the Book of Enoch. It challenges us to think critically about what we've been taught, to delve deeper, and to recognize that the tale of the giants and angels is not just a myth, but rather a chronicle of spiritual forces that have influenced human history. The trip really starts here, moving beyond myths and stories into a tale of divine justice and rebellion that goes against all we believe to be true. It's a tale just waiting to be discovered, comprehended, and recalled. Power, terror, and control are all intertwined in the account of why the giants were removed from the Western Bible. It's a story about the conscious decisions taken by influential, religious leaders who influenced what millions of people would believe for years to come, not merely about lost pages or forgotten tales. The Western Church systematically eliminated books that contradicted the straightforward narratives they wanted the faithful to believe, while determining its official canon, which is the collection of sacred scriptures judged authentic and inspired. Texts like the Book of Enoch and tales of the Watchers and their enormous progeny were among those that were eliminated. These tales were deemed perplexing, heretical, or a threat to the Church's meticulously preserved theological authority. Consider the emotional strain that these choices were based on. Was there something more sinister going on here? Or was it just a dread of theological complexity? The giants were more than just legendary characters. They also brought a legacy that challenged entrenched power. Their story was entwined with secret knowledge, divine revolt, and a link to old bloodlines that originated in Africa, notably Ethiopia. The Western Church essentially destroyed a large portion of the spiritual and cultural legacy that connected humanity to these timeless truths by deleting these sections. In addition to defining important Christian teachings, the Council of Nicaea, which met in 325 AD, was crucial in determining which books became part of the Bible and which did not. The decisions made there and at later councils were impacted by politics and power in addition to theology. The story of a simple divine plan and a pure, linear human origin was muddled by books that focused on enigmatic celestial beings or enormous descendants. Uncomfortable concerns concerning the origins of humans and the nature of evil were brought up by the existence of giants, hybrids, and prohibited knowledge. Colonial motivations also cannot be disregarded. Western nations imposed their religious beliefs to defend their dominance as they spread across continents. African heritage and spiritual identity were also undermined by the suppression of books like the Book of Enoch and the erasing of great myths. Western colonialism contributed to the rewriting of the myth by ignoring Ethiopia's old texts and history, which portrayed African peoples as unconnected to sacred past or divine purpose. This was cultural erasure, a means of controlling not only beliefs but also identity itself, and it went beyond simple religious suppression. However, Ethiopia, which was mainly cut off from these Western rulings, kept these texts, not only out of devotion, but also, many believe, because of supernatural protection. Through decades of unrest, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church protected the Book of Enoch and the Watcher stories, preserving them like a holy fire. By doing this, they preserved a spiritual heritage that Western Christianity aimed to conceal or eradicate. This preservation served as a barrier against the forces that sought to obfuscate a more profound truth. It was not an accident. The ramifications of excluding the giants from the Bible extend well beyond a forgotten period of antiquity. Eliminating the giants means removing their ancestry, their impact, and their very existence from human history. You sever the ties that bind us to a history of intricate spiritual conflicts and undiscovered wisdom. This lineage is about identity, heredity, and the reality of humanity's true origins. It's not simply about biology, it's about realizing that history is complex and that what is readily apparent is merely one aspect of the full picture. A gap is created by this omission, a silence when important questions ought to be raised. Why were these creatures excluded? Which facts were forbidden to the public? What impact does this silence have on us now? Because the giants are not mentioned in Western scripture, we are left with a history that seems unfinished and a spiritual heritage that seems broken. The giants were more than just legendary characters. They were a part of a larger narrative that featured forbidden knowledge, divine revolt, and a cosmic conflict between forces of good and evil. The Western Church changed the spiritual landscape by eliminating them, making a complicated story easier to manage and more approachable for the general public. However, there was a price for this simplification. Important insights into the beginnings of humanity and spiritual conflict were lost. By serving as a testimonial to what was concealed, the Ethiopian Bible contests this erasure. It serves as a reminder that while history is frequently penned by the winners, the hidden still awaits discovery. The Book of Enoch, the Watchers, and the giant's tale that have been preserved in Ethiopia are more than just fascinating anecdotes. They represent a potent reclamation of a spiritual legacy that many believed had been lost forever. Therefore, we need to consider what would happen if the giants were removed from the Bible. Not only do you lose stories, but you also lose identities, bloodlines, and a piece of our collective memory. We also lose sight of the whole picture of our origins and identity when we lose those. The quiet around these giants is a summons to wake up, to uncover what has been concealed, and to recover a past that has been too long hidden. Noah's flood is frequently narrated as a straightforward tale of divine retribution, a reset button hit on a world engulfed in sin and evil. However, what if there was more to the flood? What if it was a cosmic battle fought against a polluted DNA that attacked the very foundation of existence, as well as against human sin? This is the deeper reality that lies beneath the waves of scripture and history, a tragic tale of angels in tears, beasts in a frenzy, and a grieved God torn between mercy and justice. Imagine a world before the flood, where giants, hybrid creatures, created by the mating of holy watchers and human women, had taken over. These animals represented a pollution that perverted life itself, making them more than just stories. Their lineage was a contamination, a physical and spiritual infection that poisoned creation's innocence and spread like a shadow throughout the planet. This was not your typical sin. Rather, it was a perversion of the natural order and an unavoidable rebellion against the divine plan. Noah was selected due to his pure, unadulterated ancestry, which was distinct from the hybrid contamination, in addition to his moral uprightness. In the midst of chaos, his family served as a final haven of divine order. The flood was a last-ditch effort to rid the planet of this pollution, to wash away the tainted bloodlines that had infiltrated humanity and bring creation back into harmony. The deluge was a supernatural surgical assault against a genetic and spiritual invasion, not only a punishment for sin. Imagine the scenes. Hybrid giants who formerly walked the planet with terrible might now fled in terror, powerless against the impending storm, angels crying as they see their own wayward offspring destroyed. Waters rise to engulf everything in a never-ending flood of judgment and grief, as the earth groans beneath the weight of devastation. Even while he knows that the cleansing is required to maintain what is left, God himself laments the loss of the creation he fashioned good. The sorrow of this narrative is so tragic that it is staggering. The world is swept by a flood of heavenly sorrow and fury, but the flood waters are more than just water. They are the tears of a broken heaven. Instead of using swords or troops, the fight is waged with rain, waves, and the very powers of nature that have been let loose as judgment. This purifying tidal is too strong for the hideous hybrids, whose tainted lineage is doomed to disappear beneath the sea. Nevertheless, the promise of rebirth emerges among this apocalypse. Noah's Ark turns into a representation of salvation for the future of pure humanity, as well as for a family. The seed of a fresh start, an opportunity to reconstruct a world free from the specter of tainted blood, is contained in the Ark. With the promise that creation can be restored, it serves as a vessel of divine mercy in the midst of crushing judgment. Thus, the flood depicts a spiritual conflict between the forces of heaven and the hybrid progeny of rebellion that is being waged on earth. It is a tale of heavenly anguish in which mercy provides a way ahead while justice demands severe measures. This is a chronicle of a cosmic conflict with repercussions that reverberate throughout history, not merely a story from old scripture. Viewers have a fresh perspective on the flood as they take in this rendition. It was about protecting the integrity of God's creation, not only about sin and punishment. The fight against enormous blood was essential to preserving humanity's future and a pure lineage that could preserve the divine spark. The weight of what was lost, the giants that once roamed, the rebellious angels, and a God who cried over his broken creation, is something that this retelling asks us to see beyond the well-known tale. It challenges us to view the flood as a sad episode in a spiritual conflict that continues to influence our planet, rather than as an old myth. By accepting this greater understanding, viewers are captivated by a compelling and poignant story. that questions our preconceived notions and reveals long-buried facts deep within history. The flood is more than just a flood. It is also a conflict, a purification, and eventually a fresh start for a restored mankind. Usually, when we think of the Great Flood, we picture complete devastation, with water rising to cover the tallest mountains and erasing all traces of corruption and evil. However, what if that picture isn't complete? What if some of those ancient giants, the Nephilim, did not completely disappear in spite of the overwhelming judgment? Ethiopian tradition, which is reflected in oral history throughout Africa, states that some giants escaped the flood by hiding in secret locations deep within the southern mountains. This is the point at which myth, history, and living memory converge to reveal a hidden secret. The Rocky Mountains that straddle Ethiopia, Sudan, and Nubia, locations where the earth rises up as though to conceal secrets from the world, are where the story starts. Those who fled the purifying floodwaters are reported to have sought refuge in these areas, which are rich in ancient history and culture. The giants, who are referred to in the Bible as the Nephilim, or the fallen ones, are said to have sought refuge here, out of sight of those who wished to obliterate their memory from human history. These mountains are stewards of a secret heritage, not merely topographical features. Stories of the tall ones and fallen gods are still spoken down through the centuries in the villages tucked away along these mountains. Tall creatures that previously roamed among people are described by elders. Their footsteps can still be seen in the ground. These stories are more than just folklore. They are reminders of a period when the existence of these hybrids made it difficult to distinguish between the holy and the mortal. The people acknowledge these giants as part of their heritage, beings that fashioned the very soil and sky they live beneath, and speak about them with a mixture of terror and awe. This notion that not all Nephilim were exterminated is supported by the Ethiopian Bible itself, which preserves old writings like the Book of Enoch. According to the narrative, some of these hybrid creatures survived not because they were lucky, but rather because the divine plan included safe havens, such as mountains and secluded valleys, where the bloodlines could persist and be preserved outside the reach of floodwaters, and the rewriting of history. The spiritual and the material worlds continue to be closely intertwined in these areas. The term fallen gods is occasionally used to allude to the Nephilim's celestial beginnings and their nuanced place in human history. As though the giants' presence still permeates the air they breathe, the people who narrate these accounts frequently experience a living connection to these creatures. It is a legacy shrouded in mystery, a tradition that will not be entirely forgotten. The issue of tangible proof is what adds even more interest to these tales. In the hopes of discovering the skeletons that would validate these tales, explorers and archaeologists have been looking for enormous remains for decades. The bones are still elusive, though. The notion that the giants' remnants are not lost but rather hidden, protected by the very places and peoples who bear their memory, is greatly strengthened by their absence. According to some elders, these locations are guarded by ancient guardians who keep the bones safe from discovery and preserve a secret that the world is not yet prepared to face. This brings up important issues regarding memory and history. What if the history we've been taught is lacking because it doesn't include those who were too powerful, too dangerous, or too holy to be documented? What if the extinct giants continue to exist among us, not in their hideous form, but rather as a result of the traditions, whispered tales, and lineages they left behind? These creatures' ability to survive in secret locations forces us to reconsider the lines separating myth from reality and between the past and the present. Imagine a village elder sitting by a fire as night falls over the Ethiopian highlands, sharing the stories that have been passed down from his ancestors. This would humanize this old epic, as he describes the tall ones who once came down from the sky, beings whose eyes contained the wisdom of the heavens and whose feet shook the earth. His voice is steady but full of wonder. Youngsters listen with wide eyes, not as a far-off fantasy, but as an integral part of who they are. Official histories would prefer to forget these stories, which are live strands that bind the present to the past. These tales' inclusion in African oral history, especially in Ethiopia and its surrounding areas, emphasizes an important point. The history of the Nephilim and giants was concealed and preserved in ways that resisted Western attempts at censorship and control. These places turned into spiritual and physical havens, preserving truths that were considered perilous elsewhere. This preservation suggests supernatural protection and the deliberate retention of holy knowledge that may one day be made public. A new perspective on Africa's ancient kingdoms, Nubia, Kush, and Ethiopia, regions rich in colossal architecture. Mysterious ruins and tales of powerful rulers who were supposedly sprung from giants or gods is also encouraged by the notion that some giants managed to escape the flood and stay underground. Could these tales be shards of a greater reality, proof of a lineage that continued the Nephilim's heritage, subtly impacting history from the background? Viewers are urged to question the stories they have been taught and to be open to the idea that history is far more nuanced and complicated than it first seems as they reflect on these possibilities. The tale of the giants is about identity, heritage, and the strength of unspoken truths, not merely fantastical animals or a far-off history. What if the bones of the giants are preserved by people who remember them rather than being lost to time? What if the tall ones are not merely legendary characters, but perhaps forefathers whose blood silently permeates the veins of those who reside under those old mountains? A summons to awaken, explore, and seek for the secret chapters of history that have been quietly waiting in the dark for their story to be told again. These questions linger like a whisper in the wind. Bloodlines have historically held more than just genetic inheritance. They also hold identity, power, and myths that are passed down through the generations. These bloodlines, which link the enigmatic Watchers, those fallen angels who descended and fathered giants, to the royal dynasties that formed civilizations, are more than just historical anecdotes in the heart of ancient Africa. This connection, which has been preserved in the Ethiopian Bible and oral traditions, suggests something profound: the blending of African royal blood with heavenly lineage. This connection calls into question the narratives that have been imposed by foreigners and encourages a re-examination of identity itself. Take the tale of the Queen of Sheba, a mysteriously powerful and wise woman who traveled from Ethiopia to Jerusalem to see King Solomon. It's possible that their union had deeper spiritual meanings than the straightforward political or romantic ones that are frequently used to describe it. According to Ethiopian custom, their union was a holy blending of divine lineages rather than merely a diplomatic gesture. According to legend, Menelik V, the son of the Queen of Sheba, became the first Ethiopian emperor and the custodian of the Ark of the Covenant, a representation of God's power and presence. This link implies that the Watcher's old blood, which has been kept by Ethiopia's royal family, has a holy heritage that is both earthly and spiritual. Particularly in Western societies that have long minimized or omitted the African presence in biblical and spiritual history, this notion upends the fundamentals of historical narrative. These families' past serves as a potent reminder that Black identity is more than just a cultural or racial class. It is entwined with divine inheritance and a sacred mission that has withstood centuries of erasure and injustice. The story is reframed from one of victimization to one of innate dignity and unspoken grandeur. However, there is tension in the plot. Because of the brutal realities of colonialism, slavery, and ongoing structural oppression, the splendor of these ancient bloodlines has frequently been forgotten or purposefully buried. There is a strong emotional struggle brought on by the gap between the rich spiritual legacy and the actual experiences of marginalization, a desire to recapture a history that was taken away and to recall the glory that once existed. Those who bear this inheritance experience a deep-seated tension between the anguish of relocation and the promise of restoration. However, this is a tale of revival rather than hopelessness. The Ancient One's return is a metaphor for awakening, as well as a mythical occurrence. It illustrates a growing awareness among African Americans who are starting to recover their spirituality, history, and place in the world. Long submerged under layers of forgotten history, the secret kingdom is waking up again. This realization necessitates acknowledging the power that has always been there in these lineages, as well as historical injustices. This divine inheritance, an continuous line connecting the heavens and earth, past and present, is symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant, which has been kept in Ethiopia in accordance with tradition. It serves as a reminder to truth seekers that their identity is formed in the furnace of divine encounter and ancient covenant, and that their roots go deeper than the surface. The tale of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba transcends mythology and becomes a call to embrace a fate entwined with spiritual meaning. The world is being challenged by this growing consciousness to reevaluate what it means to be Black, African, and to have a human and divine ancestry. It upends the narratives of invisibility and inferiority and substitutes them with one of fortitude, knowledge, and self-determination. In the blood, the spirit, and the hearts of those who are prepared to rise, the Ancient Ones continue to exist. This hidden country bears the burden of history and the promise of change as it starts to emerge from the shadows. It is a kingdom that is characterized by a reclaiming of truth and a spiritual awakening rather than by borders or troops. Now, after decades of quiet, the story is being spoken aloud, with pride, and with an unwavering faith in the strength of tradition. The message is apparent to all who hear it. The titans of the past are ancestors whose legacy impacts the present and future, not just mythical relics. The Watcher's bloodlines run through the veins of African monarchy, linking a glorious past with an exciting future. Everyone is invited to witness the emergence of a legacy that will not be forgotten in this tale of redemption, return, and the ascent of a hidden kingdom that is about to retake its position in the world. What occurs when people lose sight of their true selves? This query, a warning veiled in mystery and spiritual weight, reverberates across time like a whisper from the past. A people become prone to erasure, manipulation, and a profound form of spiritual amnesia when they lose sight of their heritage, sacred tales, and the divine strands that bind them to something bigger. More than merely characters from old stories, the giants of history, those strong creatures descended from the Watchers, represent a tradition of divine bloodlines and spiritual conflicts that have influenced humanity's fundamental existence. However, this reality has been hidden beneath layers of silence for generations, forgotten by the outside world but tenaciously upheld within Ethiopia. There is a reason for this deletion. It is the outcome of intentional spiritual combat, a struggle waged with power over identity and narratives rather with swords. The giants and the bloodlines they stand for possess a strength that upends conventional wisdom and jeopardizes the foundations of those who wish to control history. Generations were left estranged from their spiritual strength and heavenly inheritance as a result of their stories being erased from popular culture and scripture and their memory being erased. It was a spiritual blindness, a fog over the truth, that obscures the way to awakening. And this emptiness was more than just a loss of history. Ethiopia, however, recalled, together with the spiritual teachings and oral traditions that have been passed down through the years, the Ethiopian Bible serves as a living reminder of what the outside world attempted to eradicate. It contains the tales of the giants, the Watchers, the divine bloodlines, and the flood, which was a war to purge tainted DNA as well as a form of punishment. These tales serve as warnings and predictions, calling on people to rise from their unconscious slumber and rediscover their inner strength. The giants were hidden in plain sight, their footprints wiped from public consciousness, but permanently inscribed in the earth's spiritual fabric, so they never really disappeared. This is an exhortation to rise and to remember, because their legacy concerns those who dread freedom and truth. The Titans want us to forget. However, the fact that many hearts are awakening today indicates that this period of forgetting is coming to an end. A new generation is being called forth by the divine bloodlines to reclaim their lineage and recreate human history, not as victims of the past, but as the heirs to a great and holy tradition. This is your time. If you sense this truth growing within of you, and if the Giants, Watchers, and Ethiopian preservation story resonates deeply, join this rediscovering journey by subscribing. Post your ideas, questions, and revelations in the comments section. Above all, impart this wisdom to someone who is prepared to see past appearances and recall their true self. The giants did not disappear. The world simply ceased trying to find them. Ethiopia did, however, remember, and you can now.